They told me I was nothing but dirt under their shoes, until my voice became the evidence that put a killer behind bars. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with the weight of years buried in silence. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from or what time it is where you are. Enjoy this story that might just change how you see the invisible people around you. The number 47 bus wheezed through downtown Chicago, like an old man climbing stairs, its brakes hissing at every red light along Michigan Avenue. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered with the rhythm of a dying heartbeat, casting sickly shadows across faces that had long since learned to look anywhere but at each other. The vinyl seats, cracked and patched with duct tape, told stories of 1,000 journeys by people who had nowhere else to go. Eli Martinez pressed himself into the corner of the back seat, his thin frame disappearing into the oversized hoodie that had become his second skin. At 15, he looked both younger and older than his years. Younger because malnutrition had kept him small and fragile. Older because his dark eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping on concrete and eating from dumpsters. His jeans, 3 sizes too big and held up with a rope belt, were stained with the evidence of his last 3 meals: ketchup packets from McDonald's, mustard from a hot dog vendor who'd taken pity on him, and something unidentifiable from a garbage can behind a Chinese restaurant. The other passengers gave him a wide berth, their nostrils flaring at the mixture of unwashed clothes, wet cardboard, and the particular scent of homelessness that clung to him like a second shadow. A businessman in a tailored suit moved seats when Eli sat down. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, whispering something about staying away from people like that. Even the teenagers, usually loud and fearless, lowered their voices and shot disgusted glances in his direction. Eli didn't notice, or if he did, he'd learned not to care. His attention was focused entirely on the small cassette player, clutched in his hands like a sacred relic. The device was ancient, held together with electrical tape and prayer, its once silver surface now a dull grey that spoke of years of rough handling. The headphone cord had been repaired so many times it looked like a snake made of black tape, and one of the earbuds only worked if you held it at exactly the right angle. But it still played music, and for Eli, that was enough. The bus lurched to a stop at Monroe Street, and several passengers climbed aboard, including a group of well-dressed teenagers from one of the nearby private schools. Their uniforms were crisp, their backpacks expensive, their laughter bright and careless in the way that only comes from never having to worry about where your next meal will come from. They clustered near the front of the bus, their voices carrying easily over the rumble of the engine as they discussed weekend plans and complained about homework assignments that seemed impossibly trivial to anyone who'd spent the last 5 years learning how to survive on the streets. "Did you see that new restaurant on State Street?" one of them was saying, a girl with perfectly straightened blonde hair and a designer coat that cost more than most people made in a month. "My dad says they have a 6-month waiting list just for reservations." "That's nothing," replied her friend, a boy with the kind of confident posture that comes from never having been told no about anything important. "My family's going to Aspen for spring break. Private jet, 5-star resort, the whole thing. I might even learn to ski." Their words floated through the bus like perfume, sweet and artificial and completely foreign to anyone who'd learned that luxury meant finding a warm place to sleep and enough food to stop your stomach from cramping. Eli listened without meaning to, the way homeless people learn to be aware of every conversation around them, searching for information that might be useful, for opportunities that might present themselves, for threats that might be approaching. That's when he pressed play. The cassette player clicked and whirred, its aging mechanism struggling to engage before finally catching. A soft melody emerged from the tiny speakers, barely audible over the ambient noise of the bus, but somehow cutting through the chatter like a knife through silk. It was haunting and simple, the kind of tune that seemed to bypass the brain and speak directly to something deeper, more primitive, more true. And then Eli began to sing. His voice was nothing like what anyone expected from a homeless teenager. It wasn't polished or trained, but it carried a weight that made the bus fall silent despite itself. The words that came from his lips were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across years of trauma and memory. Blue tarp in the corner, Mama's eyes so wide, cold chains in the darkness, nowhere left to hide, yellow key behind the pipe, counting days alone, singing soft to keep the fear. From chilling to the bone, the melody was hypnotic, ancient somehow, as if it had been passed down through generations of pain and loss. Eli's eyes were closed as he sang, his face tilted toward the grimy ceiling of the bus, completely lost in the music that seemed to pour from some deep well inside him. His voice cracked on certain notes, not from inexperience but from emotion too large to contain, too raw to polish. For 30 seconds, the entire bus was suspended in something approaching reverence. Even the teenagers had stopped their chatter, caught despite themselves by the unexpected beauty emerging from the corner they'd been carefully ignoring. The businessman looked up from his phone. The mother loosened her grip on her daughter's hand. For a moment, Eli wasn't just another piece of human debris to be avoided. He was a person, a voice, a story demanding to be heard. Then reality crashed back like a brick through a window. "Oh my God, what is that smell?" The blonde girl's voice cut through the silence like a blade, her face twisted in exaggerated disgust. "Driver, can't you do something about this? It's like someone died back there." Her friends erupted in laughter, the spell broken as completely as if someone had smashed the cassette player against the floor. "Maybe we should call animal control," one of them suggested, loud enough to ensure everyone on the bus could hear. "I think something crawled on board and died." "No, wait," said another, pulling out his phone with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to weaponize social media before he'd learned to drive. "This is too good. Look at this little performer back there. Hey, homeless boy, sing us another song. Maybe something about soap and shampoo." The phone camera was already recording, capturing Eli's humiliation for an audience that would find his pain entertaining, that would share his degradation as content, that would turn his most vulnerable moment into a viral joke without ever considering that he was human. Eli's voice died in his throat. His eyes snapped open, the music stopping as abruptly as if someone had yanked the power cord. He clutched the cassette player closer to his chest, his knuckles white with the effort of holding on to the one thing in his life that still brought him comfort. "Come on, don't stop now," the boy with the phone insisted, zooming in on Eli's face. "This is going straight to TikTok. You're going to be famous, the singing homeless kid of Chicago." More laughter erupted from the front of the bus, cruel and careless and designed to wound. Other passengers began to pay attention now, some looking embarrassed by the teenager's behavior, but none willing to intervene. The driver glanced in his rearview mirror, but said nothing, apparently deciding that as long as no one was physically fighting, it wasn't his problem. Eli wanted to disappear. He wanted to melt into the cracked vinyl seat and become as invisible as everyone already believed him to be. His face burned with shame, not for who he was, but for having dared to believe, even for a moment, that his voice might matter to anyone. But something inside him refused to break completely. Something that had kept him alive through 5 years on the streets, through 16 foster homes before that, through nights so cold and hungry he'd wondered if it might be easier to just stop fighting. His grip on the cassette player tightened, and he began to hum again so softly that only he could hear it. The song wasn't just music to him, it was memory. It was the last gift his mother had given him before the world went dark, and no amount of cruelty from strangers could take that away from him, no matter how much they wanted to reduce him to nothing more than entertainment for their social media feeds. What none of them knew, what Eli himself barely understood, was that the song they were mocking would soon become the key to unlocking a truth that had been buried for 10 years. A truth that would expose a killer who thought he'd gotten away with murder. A truth that would transform the boy they saw as worthless into the most important witness in the biggest criminal case Chicago had seen in a decade. But for now he was just a homeless kid on a bus, clutching a broken cassette player and humming a melody that held secrets too dangerous for anyone to imagine. 10 years earlier, Eli had been a different child entirely. His real name was Elias Miguel Santos, and he'd lived in a small apartment on the south side with his mother, Carmen, who cleaned office buildings at night and sang lullabies in Spanish during the day. Their one-bedroom home smelled like café con leche, and the lavender soap Carmen used to wash their clothes by hand in the bathtub when the laundromat machines ate their quarters. Carmen worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Days, she cleaned houses for families who paid her in cash and never learned her last name. Evenings, she stocked shelves at a grocery store where the manager called her Maria, despite her gentle corrections. Nights, she pushed a vacuum through empty office towers downtown, invisible to the executives who arrived each morning to find their wastebaskets emptied and their desks polished to perfection. "Mijo," she would whisper to 5-year-old Eli as she tucked him into their shared bed, her hands still rough from bleach and industrial cleaners. "Remember that your voice is a gift from God. No matter how hard the world tries to silence you, you must never stop singing." She taught him the melody that would later haunt the number 47 bus. It was an old song from her grandmother, passed down through generations of women who'd learned to hide their pain in music, to encode their stories in lyrics that sounded like love songs, but were really maps to survival. Carmen would hum it while she worked, while she cooked rice and beans with the skill of someone who could make a feast from scraps, while she counted their meager bills by candlelight when the electricity got cut off. The song had no official title, but Carmen called it La Canción de la Verdad, the Song of Truth. "It remembers everything we try to forget," she told Eli, her voice carrying the weight of secrets too heavy for a child to understand. "Someday, when you need it most, it will help you remember what others want you to forget." Everything changed the night Derek Hutchinson entered their lives. Derek was what people called a pillar of the community, a successful construction contractor who donated to local charities and had his photo in the newspaper every Christmas for his generous contributions to homeless shelters. He was handsome in the way that money polishes rough edges, with silver-streaked hair and expensive suits that made him look distinguished rather than predatory. His smile was practiced, warm, the kind that made people trust him instantly. He met Carmen at one of the office buildings she cleaned, staying late one night and striking up a conversation with the woman who emptied his trash and vacuumed around his feet, as if she were invisible. He complimented her English, though she spoke it perfectly. He asked about her family, though his interest felt more like an interview than genuine concern. He offered to help with her situation, though Carmen had never asked for assistance. "A beautiful woman like you shouldn't have to work so hard," Derek told her, his hand lingering on her shoulder, in a way that made Eli, hiding behind her legs, feel cold inside. "I could take care of you, both of you, give you the life you deserve." Carmen was tired, so desperately bone-deep tired from working 70 hours a week and still falling behind on rent, from patching Eli's shoes with duct tape and diluting his juice to make it last longer, from being treated like furniture by people who depended on her labor but refused to see her humanity. When Derek offered stability, a real home, security for her son, she made the mistake that countless vulnerable women make when desperation meets opportunity wrapped in expensive cologne. She said yes. The house Derek moved them into was beautiful on the surface, a 2-story colonial in Riverside, with a manicured lawn and rooms larger than their entire previous apartment. Eli had his own bedroom for the first time in his life, painted blue like the sky, with toys Derek bought by the cartload and left scattered around like evidence of his generosity. Carmen had a walk-in closet and a bathroom, with a jetted tub that she was afraid to use because she'd never seen anything so luxurious. But the house felt wrong from the first night. It was too quiet, too perfect, like a museum where they were exhibits rather than residents. Derek's rules were presented as kindness but felt like chains. Carmen shouldn't work anymore. He would provide everything they needed. She shouldn't contact her old friends. They were beneath her new station. Eli shouldn't play with neighborhood children. Derek would arrange appropriate playmates when the time was right. The basement was off limits, always locked. "Storage for my business," Derek explained. But sometimes at night, Eli heard sounds from below. Dragging, scraping, muffled voices that stopped abruptly when footsteps approached the door. Derek's kindness began to curdle within weeks. He criticized Carmen's cooking, though she'd learned to prepare his favorite meals perfectly. He mocked her accent when she was tired and slipped into Spanish. He bought her clothes that were beautiful but uncomfortable, then complained when she seemed ungrateful. "After everything I've done for you," became his favorite phrase, delivered with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The first time he hit her, Carmen tried to leave. She packed their belongings while Derek was at work, grabbed Eli's hand, and walked toward the bus stop with their few possessions in garbage bags. But Derek had been watching. He caught them 3 blocks from the house, his voice gentle and reasonable as he explained how the police would never believe a woman like her over a man like him, how immigration services might take an interest in her employment history, how Child Protective Services might decide that a mother who couldn't provide stability wasn't fit to raise a son. "You're not prisoners," he said, his arm around Carmen's shoulders in what looked like affection but felt like a threat. "You're family, and family takes care of each other. Don't they, Eli?" 6-year-old Eli nodded, even though everything inside him screamed that this man was dangerous, that his mother's fear was growing like a cancer, that the beautiful house was becoming a trap designed to look like a gift. The real horror began gradually, the way poison works, slowly, then all at once. Derek's business associates began visiting the house at strange hours, men who spoke in whispers and looked at Carmen with eyes that made her shrink into herself. The basement door stayed locked, but the sounds grew louder, more frequent. Sometimes there were voices, women's voices, that stopped abruptly and never resumed. Carmen tried to shield Eli from the truth, but children see everything, remember everything, even when adults think they're too young to understand. He saw his mother flinch when Derek touched her. He heard her crying in the bathroom at night, muffling her sobs with towels so thick they absorbed sound along with tears. He watched her grow thinner, quieter, more translucent, as if Derek was slowly erasing her from existence. The song became their secret language. When Derek was home, Carmen would hum it softly while washing dishes, and Eli would know to stay in his room, to be invisible, to make no sound that might draw attention. When Derek's friends came over, she would sing it under her breath, and Eli would hide in his closet, pressing his hands over his ears to block out the sounds that drifted up from the basement. "Remember the song, mijo," Carmen whispered to him one night, her voice so faint he had to lean close to hear. "No matter what happens, remember every word, every note. It knows things. It will help you when I can't." 3 days later, she was gone. Eli woke up alone in the house, Derek's voice drifting up from the kitchen as he spoke to someone on the phone. "She left," Derek was saying, his tone casual, almost bored. "Took off in the middle of the night. You know how these women are. Unstable, unreliable. The kid's better off without her." But Eli knew his mother would never leave him. She'd promised him 1,000 times that they would always be together, that nothing could separate them except death itself. He'd heard her voice from the basement the night before, scared, pleading, then suddenly silent. He'd pressed his ear to the floor and listened to sounds that would haunt his dreams for the next 10 years. Dragging, digging, the metallic scrape of a shovel against concrete. When the police came, they barely listened to his story. Co's 6-year-old's testimony about basement sounds and missing mothers seemed less credible than Derek Hutchinson's reputation as a community leader, and his carefully crafted narrative about an unstable woman who'd abandoned her responsibilities. Social services declared Eli a ward of the state, and Derek graciously offered to help with the transition, his public generosity hiding private relief at removing the one witness who might someday remember too much. The foster homes that followed were supposed to be temporary, but temporary stretched into months, then years. 16 different families in 10 years, each one promising stability and delivering disappointment. Some were merely indifferent, treating foster children like inconvenient obligations to be endured for the monthly stipend. Others were actively hostile, seeing vulnerable kids as convenient targets for frustrations they couldn't take out on anyone else. At the Hendersons, Eli was locked in a garage for 3 days as punishment for wetting the bed, surviving on stale crackers and garden hose water while the family went to Disney World. At the Moroccos, he was beaten with a belt for humming Carmen's song, told that crazy music was probably what had driven his mother away in the first place. At the Kellys, he was forced to sleep in a laundry room and told he should be grateful for any roof over his head, no matter how precarious. Each placement chipped away another piece of his identity, another fragment of hope, another reason to believe that the world contained kindness for children like him. The song remained his only constant, the one thing foster parents couldn't take away no matter how hard they tried. He sang it silently in closets and bathrooms, hummed it under his breath while doing chores, carried it in his heart like a flame that refused to be extinguished. At 15, when the latest foster father decided that Eli was too much trouble and needed to be taught respect with his fists, Eli finally ran. He'd learned to be invisible in foster homes, and those same skills served him on the streets. He slept in abandoned buildings and under bridges, ate from restaurant dumpsters and food pantries, kept Derek's voice alive through sheer force of will and the melody his mother had taught him. The streets of Chicago were brutal but honest. Unlike foster homes, they didn't pretend to care while slowly destroying you. Hunger was hunger, cold was cold, danger was immediate and obvious rather than disguised as kindness. Eli learned to navigate this world with the same silence that had protected him in Derek's house, the same invisibility that had saved him in foster care. But he never stopped singing Carmen's song, and the song, as she had promised, never stopped remembering. The video went live within minutes of the bus reaching its final stop. "Homeless kid thinks he's the next American Idol," read the caption, posted by Rich Kid Chicago with a string of laughing emojis and hashtags designed to maximize humiliation. "Homeless fail, like street performer, like Chicago cringe, like sing for your supper." By morning, it had been shared 8,000 times. The comments were a cesspool of casual cruelty that revealed the worst of human nature, when people felt safe behind screens and usernames. "Someone teach this kid about soap before he tries singing," wrote a Princess Brat. "Bro probably hasn't seen a shower since Obama was president. LMDU, added Money Moves 2024. "Why don't these people just get jobs instead of bothering everyone with their drama?" posted Success Mindset, as if homelessness was a lifestyle choice rather than a catastrophic failure of systems designed to protect the vulnerable. But buried among the mockery and disgust, a few comments stood out like diamonds in sewage. "That melody sounds familiar," wrote a Vintage Vinyl. "My grandmother used to sing something similar." Another user, at Truthseeker47, posted, "There's something about those lyrics, they sound less like a song and more like—" The comment cut off there, as if the writer had reconsidered sharing whatever realization had struck them. Eli knew nothing about the video's viral spread. He'd spent the night in an abandoned warehouse on the south side, curled up in a sleeping bag that smelled like mildew and broken dreams, his cassette player clutched to his chest like a shield against the darkness. He'd learned to sleep lightly on the streets, trained by necessity to wake at the slightest sound that might signal danger, but exhaustion had finally claimed him completely. He woke to the sound of rain drumming against the warehouse's corrugated metal roof, a steady percussion that matched the rhythm of his empty stomach. The November cold had seeped through the sleeping bag during the night, leaving his joints stiff and his fingers numb. He'd been living rough for 3 years now, but his body had never fully adapted to the constant exposure, the inadequate nutrition, the stress of never feeling truly safe. The cassette player's battery was dying. He could tell by the way Carmen's song played slightly slower than usual, her voice distorted into something that sounded more ghostly than human. He had exactly $17.38 left from his last panhandling session, enough for batteries and maybe a breakfast sandwich if he was careful. The money was hidden in a plastic bag inside his shoe, a trick he'd learned from other street kids who discovered that predators searched pockets but rarely checked feet. Chicago's downtown streets were already bustling with the morning rush hour crowd when Eli emerged from the warehouse. His hoodie pulled up against the drizzle that made everything gray and miserable. Office workers hurried past with smartphones pressed to their ears, their conversations about meetings and deadlines floating past him like transmissions from another planet. He was invisible to them, just another piece of urban debris to be avoided, another reminder of problems they preferred not to acknowledge. But today felt different. People were staring, not the usual careful avoidance that marked most interactions between the housed and unhoused, but direct stares accompanied by whispers and pointing. A group of teenagers near the Starbucks on State Street burst into laughter when they saw him, one of them holding up a phone in his direction. "Oh my God, it's him," the girl squealed. "It's the singing homeless kid." Confusion crashed over Eli like a cold wave. He'd been invisible for so long that sudden visibility felt more threatening than comforting. His first instinct was to run, to find another neighborhood where he could disappear back into anonymity, but curiosity held him frozen on the sidewalk. "Sing for us!" shouted one of the boys, pulling out his own phone to start recording. "Come on, do that crazy song again, you're like totally famous now." Famous. The word hit Eli like a physical blow. He'd never wanted fame, had never sought attention. His song was private, sacred, a connection to the mother who'd been stolen from him. The idea that it had been shared, mocked, turned into entertainment for strangers made him feel sick to his stomach. He turned and walked away quickly, but the laughter followed him down the block. Other people were looking now, some with recognition, others with the kind of morbid curiosity that treated human suffering as amusement. A businessman in an expensive coat nudged his companion and pointed in Eli's direction. "That's the kid from the video," he said loud enough for Eli to hear. "The one who thinks he's some kind of performer. Absolutely delusional." 3 blocks away outside a McDonald's, where he sometimes begged for spare change, Eli overheard a conversation that made his blood freeze. "I swear I've heard that song before," a woman was saying to her friend, both of them looking at a phone screen. "Play it again, there, that part about the blue tarp and the chains. My sister works for the police department, and she mentioned a cold case a few years back that had similar details." "Don't be ridiculous," her friend replied. It's just some crazy homeless kid making up random words. You think he's some kind of secret witness or something? But the first woman looked troubled, her face creased with the kind of concentration that comes when buried memories suddenly surface. I'm telling you, Sarah, those aren't random words. They're too specific, too real. Eli's hands began to shake. Not from the cold this time, but from a fear that ran deeper than physical discomfort. Someone was listening, really listening. Not to mock or ridicule, but to understand. After 10 years of being dismissed, ignored, and silenced, the possibility that his song might finally be heard felt both thrilling and terrifying. He hurried away from the McDonald's, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to approach the woman, to tell her she was right, that the song wasn't random at all, but a map to a truth that had been buried in Derek Hutchinson's basement. But another part, the part that had learned survival through silence, warned him that speaking up would only bring danger. The woman's name was Detective Sarah Chen, though Eli didn't know it at the time. She was 34 years old, a 12-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, who specialized in cold cases involving missing persons. She'd seen the video the night before, shared by her teenage nephew, who'd thought his aunt might find the crazy, singing homeless kid amusing. But Sarah hadn't laughed. She'd listened with the trained ear of someone who'd spent years sorting truth from deception, reality from fantasy. The melody was haunting, yes, but it was the lyrics that had made her sit up straight in her living room, reaching for the case files she kept in her home office. The Carmen Santos case had haunted her for 7 years. A young Latina woman who disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a 6-year-old son who'd been placed in foster care after his increasingly incoherent claims about basement sounds and buried bodies had been dismissed as trauma-induced fantasy. The boyfriend, Derek Hutchinson, had been questioned briefly but never seriously considered as a suspect. He was too prominent, too respected, too skilled at presenting himself as the grieving partner of a woman who'd simply chosen to abandon her responsibilities. Sarah had always believed there was more to the story. Carmen Santos wasn't the type to abandon her child. Everyone who knew her said so. She was devoted to Eli, worked multiple jobs to support him, had no history of mental illness or drug abuse that might explain a sudden departure. But without evidence, without witnesses, without even a body, the case had gone cold. Now listening to a homeless teenager sing about blue tarps and chains, about yellow keys hidden behind pipes, about Mama's wide eyes and nowhere left to hide, Sarah felt pieces of a decade-old puzzle beginning to click into place. She called in sick to work that day and spent the morning tracking down everything she could find about the viral video. The original post led her to the social media profiles of the teenagers who'd recorded it. Kids from Lincoln Park, with trust funds and private school educations, who'd never spent a day worrying about where their next meal would come from. Their casual cruelty toward Eli turned her stomach, but it also provided useful information. The video had been filmed on the number 47 bus route, which meant Eli was probably living somewhere on the south side. Sarah knew the area well. She'd grown up not far from there, in a neighborhood where kids like Eli disappeared regularly without anyone important enough to demand investigation. But finding one homeless teenager in a city of 3 million people would be like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. Sarah needed help, and she knew exactly who to call. Father Miguel Restrepo ran Sacred Heart Shelter, a facility that provided meals and temporary housing for Chicago's homeless population. He was a small man with calloused hands and kind eyes who'd spent 20 years earning the trust of people society had abandoned. If anyone would know how to find Eli, it would be Miguel. "I've seen the video," Miguel said when Sarah explained what she needed. "That boy, there's something familiar about him. I think he's been to the shelter before, but he never stays long. Doesn't trust adults much, which I can understand given what these kids usually go through." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "How can we find him?" "Very carefully," Miguel replied. "Kids like this, they spook easily. If he thinks he's in trouble, he'll disappear completely. We need to approach this like we're trying to help him, not interrogate him." "We are trying to help him," Sarah said firmly. "If he's who I think he is, if that song means what I think it means, then he's been carrying a terrible burden for way too long." That afternoon, Miguel and Sarah began what would become a careful, patient search through Chicago's network of shelters, soup kitchens, and informal homeless camps. They showed Eli's photo, captured from the viral video, to social workers and volunteers, to other homeless individuals who might have crossed paths with him, to anyone who might have seen a teenage boy with an old cassette player and a song that sounded like a cry for help. It took 3 days to find him. He was sleeping in a doorway behind a defunct restaurant, his cassette player dead finally, its batteries exhausted. Sarah and Miguel approached slowly, hands visible, voices soft, the way you might approach a wounded animal that could bolt at any sudden movement. "Eli," Sarah said gently, "my name is Detective Chen. I'm not here to arrest you or move you along. I'm here because I think your song might be important. I think it might help us find out what happened to your mother." For a moment, Eli's world stopped spinning. 10 years of silence, 10 years of being dismissed and ignored and told his memories were just childish imagination, and now this woman, this stranger, was saying she believed him. But trust, once shattered, doesn't reassemble easily. Eli's first instinct was still to run. Derek Hutchinson's morning routine had remained unchanged for 12 years. Coffee at 6 a.m. sharp, prepared by his housekeeper Maria, in the same kitchen where he'd once promised Carmen Santos a better life. The Chicago Tribune spread across his granite countertop, its pages filled with stories of other people's tragedies that he read with the detached interest of someone reviewing stock reports. By 6:30, he was dressed in one of his handmade suits, checking his reflection in the mirror with the satisfaction of a man who'd built an empire on other people's graves. At 58, Derek had evolved from a simple predator into something far more dangerous, a respected member of society. Hutchinson Construction had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise with contracts throughout the Midwest and a reputation for completing projects under budget and ahead of schedule. The secret to his success was simple. He knew how to dispose of problems permanently, whether they were cost overruns, troublesome inspectors, or women who'd seen too much. His charitable work had earned him a place on the boards of 3 non-profits, including the Children's Advocacy Center of Chicago, where his generous donations helped fund programs for abused and neglected youth. The irony wasn't lost on him. It was carefully calculated. Nothing deflected suspicion like a public commitment to protecting the very demographic you preyed upon in private. His phone buzzed at 7:15 a.m. with a text from his attorney, Marcus Webb. "Need to discuss something urgent." "Coffee in an hour," Derek frowned. Marcus wasn't the type to use words like urgent casually. In 15 years of handling Derek's legal affairs, he'd learned to communicate in careful euphemisms that protected both of them from conversations that might later prove problematic. They met at the University Club, an old money establishment where Chicago's elite gathered to conduct business over breakfast and bourbon. Marcus was already waiting in their usual corner booth, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expression carefully neutral. But Derek could read the tension in his posture, the way his manicured fingers drummed against the mahogany table. "We have a situation," Marcus said without preamble, sliding his phone across the table. The screen showed a frozen frame from a video, a homeless teenager on a bus, his mouth open in song. "This went viral 3 days ago. 8 million views and counting." Derek's coffee turned to ash in his mouth. The boy in the video looked nothing like the 6-year-old Eli he remembered, but something about the eyes, the bone structure of the face, sent ice through his veins. "Who is it?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me," Marcus replied, "because Detective Sarah Chen from the Chicago PD spent yesterday asking questions about the Carmen Santos case. Remember her? The woman who disappeared about 10 years ago?" The name hit Derek like a physical blow, though his expression never changed. He'd trained himself long ago to show nothing, to react to even the most devastating news with the calm indifference of someone discussing the weather. Vaguely, wasn't she some cleaning woman who abandoned her kid? "That's the official story, yes." Marcus's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But this homeless boy has been singing a song. A very specific song. About blue tarps and chains and yellow keys behind pipes. Ring any bells?" Derek's hand tightened imperceptibly around his coffee cup. Blue tarp, like the one he'd wrapped Carmen's body in before burying her beneath the basement floor. Chains, like the ones he'd used to secure her when she tried to fight back. Yellow key, like the spare basement key he'd hidden behind the water pipe, the one only he and Carmen had known about. "Kids make up stories," Derek said carefully, "especially damaged kids from broken homes. I'm sure social services has documentation about his psychological issues." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, "but Detective Chen doesn't seem convinced. She's been showing his picture around homeless shelters, asking questions about missing persons cases, making phone calls to people who worked the Santos investigation. She's treating this like an active case, not a cold file. Derek's mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. Sarah Chen had been a junior detective when Carmen disappeared, too low on the hierarchy to ask uncomfortable questions or challenge the narrative he'd so carefully constructed. But a decade of experience had made her dangerous, and the viral video had given her leverage she'd never possessed before. "What's our exposure?" Derek asked, the pronoun chosen deliberately. Marcus had helped dispose of evidence after Carmen's death, had prepared the legal documents that transferred custody of Eli to the state, had crafted the stories that explained away any inconsistencies in Derek's account. They were bound together by shared guilt and mutual assured destruction. "Minimal if we handle this correctly," Marcus replied. "The boy's been on the streets for years. No permanent address, no social connections, a history of mental health issues documented in his foster care records. If something happened to him, an overdose, a violent encounter with other homeless individuals, a tragic accident, it would barely merit a news story." The suggestion hung between them like smoke, toxic and suffocating. Derek had never killed a child before, had told himself there were lines he wouldn't cross. But Eli wasn't really a child anymore, was he? He was 15, practically an adult, and more importantly, he was a threat that needed to be eliminated. "Let me think about it," Derek said finally. "In the meantime, what can we do about Detective Chen?" "I'm already working on that." Marcus smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who'd turned corruption into an art form. "I have friends in internal affairs, a complaint about harassment of the homeless community, questions about Detective Chen's motivations in pursuing a closed case, suggestions that she's seeking publicity rather than justice. It won't destroy her career, but it might slow her down long enough for us to handle the other problem." Across town in a small apartment that smelled like coffee and determination, Sarah Chen was building a case that would either make her career or destroy it completely. Her dining room table was covered with files, photographs, witness statements, and computer printouts that chronicled 10 years of investigation into Carmen Santos's disappearance. The official conclusion had always frustrated her. Subject left voluntarily, likely to start new life elsewhere. No evidence of foul play, but the evidence had never supported that conclusion. Carmen had no money to start over, no transportation to leave the city, no history of abandoning responsibilities. Her bank account remained untouched after her disappearance. Her job applications at cleaning services throughout the Chicago area had been submitted the week before she vanished, hardly the behavior of someone planning to flee. More troubling were the inconsistencies in Derek Hutchinson's statements. He'd told police that Carmen had been depressed about her immigration status, but her legal residency was well documented. He'd claimed she'd talked about returning to Mexico, but she'd never lived there. She was second-generation American, born in Chicago. He'd said she'd been struggling with alcohol, but medical records showed no evidence of substance abuse. The 6-year-old boy's statements had been dismissed as fantasy, but Sarah had reviewed them with fresh eyes and found them remarkably consistent. Eli had described sounds from the basement, digging, dragging, the sound of metal against concrete. He'd mentioned smells, bleach, wet earth, something sweet and rotting. He'd drawn pictures of his mother with sad eyes and hurt hands, details that suggested he'd witnessed violence. Most compelling was the song itself. Sarah had played it dozens of times, analyzing each verse like a forensic linguist. The lyrics weren't the random words of a disturbed teenager. They were specific, detailed, laden with information that could only come from direct experience. Blue tarp in the corner. Industrial tarps were commonly used in construction and body disposal. Cold chains in the darkness, restraints that left marks consistent with struggle. Yellow key behind the pipe, a specific hiding place that suggested intimate knowledge of the location. Father Miguel had convinced Eli to trust her, slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone who understood that traumatized children moved at their own pace. Their first conversation had lasted only 5 minutes. Eli had answered her questions in monosyllables before retreating into the protective shell he'd built around himself. But each subsequent meeting had yielded a little more information, another piece of the puzzle that had been scattered by time and trauma. The basement had a blue door, Eli had whispered during their third conversation, his voice barely audible over the shelter's ambient noise. "It was always locked, but I could hear things. Mama said not to listen, but the sounds came through the floor anyway." "What kind of sounds?" Sarah had asked gently. "Digging, like someone making a hole, and crying that stopped real sudden." Eli's hands had shaken as he spoke, the adult body unable to forget what the child's mind had tried to suppress. The morning she was gone, Derek was washing blood off a shovel in the garage. He said he'd cut himself working, but there wasn't no cut on his hands. Each revelation had been another nail in Derek Hutchinson's coffin, but Sarah needed more than a traumatized teenager's recovered memories. She needed physical evidence, and that meant getting inside Derek's house, the same house where Carmen had disappeared, the same basement where Eli claimed to have heard digging. Getting a search warrant would be nearly impossible. Derek's reputation in the community, combined with the decade that had passed since Carmen's disappearance, meant that any judge would demand extraordinary evidence before authorizing an intrusion on such a prominent citizen's privacy. But Sarah had learned patience during her years working cold cases. Sometimes justice moved slowly, but it moved inevitably toward truth. Her phone rang at 9 p.m., interrupting her review of the case files. The caller ID showed her supervisor's number, which was unusual for such a late hour. "Chen, we need to talk." Lieutenant Morrison's voice was tense, official. "My office. First thing tomorrow morning." "About what, sir?" "You know what. The Santos case. I've been getting calls, Chen. People are asking questions about why you're harassing a respected businessman over a case that was closed years ago. They're questioning your motives, your methods, your judgment." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Sir, I have new evidence. The homeless teenager who's been living on the streets for years and has a documented history of psychological problems." Morrison's tone was sharp with disapproval. "Chen, I've seen his foster care records. This kid has been in and out of psychiatric facilities since he was 8 years old. His testimony wouldn't hold up in traffic court, let alone a murder trial. But the details in his song match. The details in his song could come from anywhere. TV shows, other homeless people's stories, pure imagination. You're building a case on quicksand, detective, and it's starting to affect your credibility." The conversation continued for another few minutes, but Sarah could hear the subtext clearly. Back off or face consequences. Someone with influence was applying pressure, someone who wanted the Santos case to remain buried. But that only convinced her more completely that she was on the right track. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her living room and listened to Eli's song one more time. In the haunting melody and fractured lyrics, she heard a truth that powerful people were desperate to silence, and in the boy who'd carried that truth for 10 years, despite abandonment and abuse and systematic dismissal, she saw a strength that no amount of privilege or influence could break. Tomorrow she would face pressure to drop the case. Derek Hutchinson would use every connection, every favor owed, every threat available to protect himself. But tonight, Sarah Chen made a decision that would change everything. She was going to trust a homeless teenager over the entire weight of Chicago's power structure, because sometimes the only voices worth listening to were the ones everyone else wanted to silence. The meeting in Lieutenant Morrison's office felt like a tribunal. Sarah entered to find not just her supervisor, but Deputy Chief Patricia Rawlings and Internal Affairs Detective James Murphy, their faces arranged in expressions of professional disappointment that barely concealed something darker beneath. The chairs were positioned to make her feel isolated, outnumbered, small. "Sit down, Detective Chen," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "We need to discuss your recent activities regarding the Santos case." Sarah remained standing. Something about the setup, the formal language, the presence of internal affairs told her this wasn't a discussion, but an execution. "Sir, if this is about my investigation—" "Investigation?" Deputy Chief Rawlings interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Detective, you've been harassing a prominent member of our community based on the delusions of a mentally unstable homeless teenager. That's not investigation, that's persecution." The word delusions hit Sarah like a slap. These were the same people who'd dismissed Eli's testimony 10 years ago, who'd chosen to believe Derek Hutchinson's carefully crafted lies over a traumatized child's desperate truth. "Ma'am, with respect, new evidence has come to light that suggests—" "New evidence?" Detective Murphy leaned forward, his smile predatory. "You mean a viral video of a homeless boy singing nonsense words? That's your evidence?" Sarah felt her jaw clench. "Those aren't nonsense words. They're specific details that match." "They match details that were in the original police reports," Deputy Chief Rawlings said coolly. "Reports that are publicly accessible through Freedom of Information Act requests. Anyone could have read those details and incorporated them into a song." The implication hung in the air like poison that Eli had somehow researched his own mother's disappearance, studied police reports he couldn't access, and crafted an elaborate deception for reasons no one could explain. It was absurd, but it was also the kind of official narrative that would allow everyone to sleep soundly while a killer walked free. "Ma'am, this boy was 6 years old when his mother disappeared. He's been on the streets for years. How exactly would he have accessed?" Detective Chen, Lieutenant Morrison's voice cut through her protest like a blade. "You're being reassigned. Effective immediately. Vice Division needs help with a prostitution ring operating out of Chinatown. Consider it an opportunity to work cases that actually matter to this community." The room went silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the precinct beyond the closed door. Sarah understood the message. Pursue cases that didn't threaten important people. Investigate crimes that didn't implicate campaign donors. Be a good soldier and stop asking inconvenient questions. "And Detective," Deputy Chief Rawlings added, her voice deceptively gentle, "any further contact with the homeless individual in question will be considered harassment. We've already received complaints from Mr. Hutchinson's legal representatives about your conduct. Another complaint could result in suspension pending review." Sarah walked out of that office, feeling like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. 20 years of believing in justice, of trusting that the system would eventually protect the innocent and punish the guilty, crumbled in the space of 15 minutes. She sat in her car in the precinct parking lot and let the tears come, mourning not just for Eli but for her own naive faith in institutions that had revealed themselves to be nothing more than mechanisms for protecting the powerful. But grief, she discovered, could transform into something much more dangerous: rage. That evening, Sarah drove to Sacred Heart Shelter with a determination that burned like acid in her chest. She found Eli in the common room, hunched over a puzzle that someone had donated, his fingers tracing the edges of pieces that didn't quite fit together. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. "Eli," she said softly, settling into the chair beside him, "I need to tell you something." He looked up with eyes that had learned to expect disappointment, betrayal, abandonment. "They told you to stop, didn't they? The police. They said I was crazy, that my song doesn't mean nothing." The resignation in his voice broke something inside Sarah's chest. Here was a boy who'd been silenced his entire life, who'd carried the truth of his mother's murder for 10 years, and now the very people sworn to protect him were calling him delusional. "Yes, they told me to stop, but I'm not going to." Eli's hands stilled on the puzzle pieces. "What?" "I said I'm not going to stop." Sarah's voice was steady, certain, carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "Because I believe you. I believe every word of your song, every detail you've shared with me, and I'm going to prove that Derek Hutchinson killed your mother." For the first time in 3 years, tears spilled down Eli's cheeks. Not tears of pain or fear, but of relief so profound it seemed to physically transform him. Someone believed him. After a decade of being dismissed, medicated, institutionalized and abandoned, someone with authority and power was finally listening. "But they'll fire you," he whispered. "They'll hurt you like they hurt everyone who tries to help." Sarah smiled grimly. "Let them try. But Eli, I need your help. I need you to remember everything you can about that house, about the basement, about the night your mother disappeared. Can you do that?" Over the next hour, Eli shared details he'd never spoken aloud before. The layout of Derek's house, down to the creaky third step on the basement stairs. The location of the spare key, hidden behind a pipe exactly where his song described. The sounds he'd heard that final night. His mother's voice pleading. Derek's voice responding with cold fury, then silence that stretched until dawn. Most importantly, Eli remembered something he'd never told anyone. He'd seen Derek bury something in the backyard the morning after Carmen disappeared. A small box, wrapped in plastic, hidden beneath the oak tree where Carmen used to hang laundry to dry. Eli had been watching from his bedroom window, too afraid to move, too traumatized to understand what he was witnessing. "What kind of box?" Sarah asked, her pulse quickening. "Like a jewelry box. Silver, with flowers on it. Mama kept her wedding ring in it, the one from her first marriage. She said it was the only thing worth keeping from her past." Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. If Derek had buried Carmen's personal effects, if physical evidence still existed after all these years, then they had something more than traumatic memories and song lyrics. They had potential proof, but getting access to Derek's property would require a search warrant, and Sarah had just been explicitly ordered to stay away from the case. Any official action would end her career and possibly land her in jail for insubordination. She sat in the shelter's common room, watching Eli work on his puzzle, and realized she was facing the most important decision of her life. She could be a good detective, follow orders, protect her pension and reputation, or she could be a good human being and fight for a boy who'd been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect him. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Eli," she said finally, "how would you feel about taking a drive past your old house, just to see if anything looks familiar?" 3 days later, on a cold November evening when Derek was attending a charity fundraiser downtown, Sarah and Eli sat in her unmarked car across from the house where Carmen Santos had been murdered. The Colonial looked exactly as Eli remembered, pristine, expensive, designed to project success and respectability to anyone who might be watching. "The oak tree," Eli whispered, pointing to the backyard visible through a gap in the wooden fence. "Right there, maybe 6 feet from the trunk. That's where he buried it." Sarah stared at the property that had become a tomb, both literal and metaphorical. Carmen's body was somewhere beneath that basement floor, and her jewelry box was somewhere beneath that tree. Evidence that could destroy Derek Hutchinson and vindicate the boy beside her was separated from them by nothing more than a fence and a legal system designed to protect monsters. "What if we just looked?" Eli said quietly. "What if we just went over there just to see? We wouldn't take nothing, wouldn't disturb nothing, just looked." Sarah knew exactly what he was suggesting. Trespassing, illegal search, destruction of evidence chain, career suicide. Everything she'd been trained not to do. Every rule she'd sworn to uphold. But sometimes, she realized, justice required breaking unjust laws. Sometimes the only way to save a system was to be willing to sacrifice yourself to it. "Eli," she said, her voice steady with a decision that would change everything, "how good are you at climbing fences?" The boy who'd been invisible his entire life smiled for the first time in years. "Lady, I've been climbing fences since I could walk." As they approached Derek Hutchinson's backyard, Sarah Chen felt the weight of her badge, her oath, her entire career pressing down on her shoulders. But she also felt something else, the certainty that some truths were too important to remain buried, no matter what the cost of digging them up. Behind them, the city lights of Chicago twinkled like stars, beautiful and distant and completely unaware that in a quiet suburb, 2 people were about to risk everything to prove that the dead deserve justice and the living deserve to be heard. Even when they're homeless teenagers with songs that nobody wants to believe, especially then. The fence was easier to climb than Sarah had expected. Years of chasing suspects through Chicago's back alleys had kept her in decent shape, and Eli moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent half his life navigating barriers designed to keep people like him out. They dropped into Derek Hutchinson's backyard like shadows, their footsteps muffled by grass that was still green, despite the November cold. The oak tree stood exactly where Eli remembered, its massive trunk scarred by decades of Chicago winters, but still strong, still beautiful. Carmen's laundry line had long since been removed, but Sarah could imagine her hanging clothes there on summer mornings, humming the same song her son now carried like a torch through the darkness. 6 feet from the trunk, Eli whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. Toward the house, he dug it up real careful like he didn't want to hurt the roots. Sarah knelt beside the tree, running her hands over the earth that felt softer in one particular spot, as if it had been disturbed and never quite settled back to its original density. She'd brought a small camping shovel from her car, nothing professional or obvious, just a tool that might pass for gardening equipment if anyone asked questions. The first shovelful of dirt came up dark and rich, different from the clay that characterized most Chicago soil. Someone had amended this earth, added topsoil to help grass grow over whatever lay beneath. Sarah's pulse quickened as she dug deeper, her movements careful and methodical, despite the adrenaline racing through her system. Eli kept watch, his eyes scanning the neighboring houses for any sign of movement, any indication that their trespass had been noticed. The suburb was quiet at this hour. Most residents settled in for the evening with their televisions and family dinners, secure in the knowledge that their well-ordered world was protected from the chaos that plagued less fortunate neighborhoods. "There," Sarah breathed, her shovel scraping against something that wasn't dirt or root. "Eli, I think I found it." She switched to using her hands, brushing soil away from a rectangular object, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, that had somehow survived a decade underground. The wrapping was still intact, sealed with electrical tape that spoke to Derek's methodical approach to concealing evidence. This wasn't the hasty burial of someone in panic. This was the careful disposal of someone who'd planned for the possibility of discovery. The plastic peeled away to reveal exactly what Eli had described. A silver jewelry box adorned with roses, its surface tarnished but still recognizable. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the clasp, revealing contents that would transform a cold case into the prosecution of the decade. Inside lay Carmen's wedding ring from her first marriage, exactly as Eli had remembered. But there was more. A driver's license with Carmen's photo and address, several pieces of jewelry that Derek had apparently considered too valuable to leave buried with the body, and most importantly, a small digital camera that Sarah hadn't expected to find. "She must have been documenting something," Sarah whispered, examining the camera's casing. The device was old, from an era when people still used dedicated cameras instead of phones, but it appeared to be intact. If this still works, if there are photos, the implications were staggering. Carmen Santos hadn't just been a victim. She might have been gathering evidence against Derek before her murder. The camera could contain proof of his crimes, documentation of whatever illegal activities had made her too dangerous to let live. "We need to get out of here," Eli said urgently, his voice tight with the kind of fear that comes from years of learning to recognize danger before it arrives. "I hear a car." Sarah quickly wrapped the jewelry box back in plastic and tucked it inside her jacket. They filled in the hole as best they could, scattering leaves over the disturbed earth to mask their excavation. The entire process took less than 15 minutes, but it felt like hours to two people who were committing multiple felonies in service of a truth that nobody in power wanted to hear. They climbed back over the fence just as headlights swept across the front of Derek's house. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as they crouched beside her car, watching Derek's Mercedes pull into the driveway 3 hours earlier than expected. If they'd been delayed by even a few minutes, if the earth had been more difficult to dig, if the box had been buried deeper. "Close," Eli whispered, and Sarah could hear the relief in his voice. For the first time in his life, luck had favored him instead of the powerful people who'd spent a decade trying to erase his truth. Back at Sarah's apartment, they examined their discovery under proper lighting. The jewelry box yielded treasures beyond their wildest hopes, not just Carmen's personal effects, but business cards for immigration lawyers, newspaper clippings about missing women, and handwritten notes in Spanish that documented Derek's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks before her death. But the camera proved to be the real revelation. Its battery was long dead, but Sarah managed to remove the memory card and transfer its contents to her laptop. What they found made both of them sit back in stunned silence. Dozens of photographs, taken secretly by Carmen in the weeks before her murder. Pictures of Derek meeting with men who looked nothing like legitimate business associates. Images of the basement that had been off-limits to Carmen and Eli, showing not storage, but something far more sinister, what appeared to be a holding area, complete with chains, restraints, and bloodstains on concrete walls. Most damning were the photos of other women, clearly taken without their knowledge or consent. Young women, vulnerable women, many of whom appeared to be undocumented immigrants who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared. Carmen had somehow discovered that Derek's construction business was a front for human trafficking, and she'd been building a case against him when he'd discovered her investigation. "She was trying to save them," Eli whispered, staring at a photo of a terrified girl who couldn't have been more than 16. "She found out what he was doing, and she was trying to save them." Sarah felt sick looking at the evidence of Derek's crimes, but she also felt vindicated. Carmen Santos hadn't been killed because she'd tried to leave. She'd been murdered because she'd tried to expose a monster. Her disappearance hadn't been the random tragedy of domestic violence, but a calculated execution designed to protect a criminal enterprise that had destroyed countless lives. "We need to take this to the FBI," Sarah said, her mind racing through jurisdictions and protocols. "Human trafficking is federal. This goes way beyond Chicago PD's authority." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew the challenges they faced. The evidence had been obtained illegally. Any prosecutor would struggle to justify a case built on trespassing and unauthorized excavation. Derek's lawyers would argue that the photos had been planted, that the jewelry box was fabricated, that the entire discovery was an elaborate frame job orchestrated by a rogue detective, and a mentally unstable teenager. "They won't believe us," Eli said quietly, voicing the fear that Sarah didn't want to acknowledge. "They'll say we made it all up, that we planted the box ourselves. Who's going to believe a homeless kid and a cop who disobeyed orders?" Sarah stared at the photos on her laptop screen, evidence of crimes that demanded justice but might never see the inside of a courtroom. She thought about all the women in those pictures, about Carmen Santos who died trying to save them, about Eli who'd carried his mother's truth for 10 years without anyone listening. Then she remembered the viral video that had started this entire investigation. Social media had been used to mock and humiliate Eli, but it was also the reason Sarah had found him in the first place. Sometimes the court of public opinion moved faster than legal institutions, especially when those institutions were compromised by corruption and influence. "Eli," she said slowly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or completely insane, "how do you feel about singing your song one more time? But this time, with evidence to back up every single word?" The boy who'd been silenced his entire life looked at the photos of his mother's investigation, at the proof that she'd died a hero rather than a victim, and for the first time in 10 years, he smiled with something approaching joy. "Lady," he said, his voice stronger than Sarah had ever heard it, "I've been waiting my whole life to sing this song the right way." That night, Sarah Chen made a decision that would either destroy her career or transform it into something far more meaningful than she'd ever imagined. She was going to bypass the corrupt system that protected Derek Hutchinson and appeal directly to the only authority that mattered: the truth, witnessed by millions of people who would refuse to let it be buried again. Sometimes justice required working within the system, and sometimes it required burning the system down and building something better from the ashes. Sarah looked at the evidence spread across her kitchen table, at the boy who'd survived everything the world could throw at him, and decided that after 10 years of waiting, Carmen Santos deserved to have her story told properly, even if it meant sacrificing everything to tell it. The press conference was held at Sacred Heart Shelter, in the same common room where Eli had worked on puzzles and tried to piece together fragments of his shattered life. Father Miguel had agreed to host the event after Sarah explained what they'd discovered, his weathered face grave with understanding of what this moment meant for every voiceless person who'd ever been dismissed by those in power. Sarah had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing, knowing she had one chance to get this right. If Derek's lawyers managed to suppress the story before it gained traction, if the media dismissed Eli as just another troubled homeless teenager, if the public chose to believe comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, then everything they'd risked would be for nothing. The room filled slowly with an unlikely mix of people: homeless advocates who'd heard whispers about a breakthrough case, crime reporters following up on rumors of new evidence in a cold case, social media influencers who'd been tracking the viral video's unexpected evolution into something more serious. In the back row, Sarah noticed 2 FBI agents who'd received her anonymous tip about federal crimes and decided to investigate despite their skepticism. Eli sat beside Sarah at a folding table that had been covered with a white cloth to look more official. He wore clothes that Father Miguel had found for him: clean jeans, a button-down shirt, sneakers without holes, but more importantly, he wore an expression Sarah had never seen before: determination. The boy who'd spent 5 years invisible on Chicago's streets was ready to be seen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to unleash. 10 years ago, Carmen Santos disappeared from her home in Riverside. She left behind a 6-year-old son and a mystery that the Chicago Police Department was never able to solve. Today, that mystery ends. She gestured to Eli, whose hands rested calmly on the table despite the weight of the moment. "This is Elias Santos, Carmen's son. For 10 years, he's tried to tell anyone who would listen what happened to his mother. For 10 years, he's been dismissed, medicated, institutionalized, and ignored. 3 weeks ago, his story went viral when teenagers on a bus filmed him singing what they thought was a nonsense song." Sarah paused, letting the irony sink in. It wasn't nonsense. It was testimony. It was evidence. It was a cry for help that took 10 years to be heard. She opened her laptop and displayed the first photograph from Carmen's camera: Derek meeting with men who clearly weren't legitimate business associates. Carmen Santos wasn't killed because she tried to leave Derek Hutchinson. She was murdered because she discovered that his construction business was a front for human trafficking. She was building a case against him when he discovered her investigation. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Phones came out as reporters began live tweeting the revelations. The FBI agents in the back row leaned forward, their skepticism replaced by intense interest. The evidence we've uncovered includes dozens of photographs taken by Carmen in the weeks before her death, documentation of a criminal enterprise that has destroyed countless lives, and proof that Derek Hutchinson is responsible for crimes that go far beyond the murder of one woman. Sarah displayed more photos: the basement holding area, the terrified faces of trafficking victims, the business records Carmen had copied before her death. Each image landed like a bomb in the room, confirming details that painted a picture of systematic horror hidden behind charitable donations and community leadership. But the most powerful evidence, Sarah said, turning to Eli, comes from the boy who survived. Eli, would you tell them about your song? For a moment, Eli seemed to shrink back into himself, the weight of 10 years pressing down on his shoulders. But then he looked at the photo of his mother displayed on the screen, saw her courage in documenting crimes that she knew might cost her life, and found strength he didn't know he possessed. "My mama taught me this song when I was little," he said, his voice soft but clear enough to carry to every corner of the room. "She said it would help me remember things that other people might want me to forget. I didn't understand what she meant until it was too late." He stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor, and began to sing. But this time, his voice didn't crack with pain or shake with fear. This time, he sang with the power of truth finally being heard. Blue tarp in the corner, Mama's eyes so wide, cold chains in the darkness, nowhere left to hide, yellow key behind the pipe, counting days alone, singing soft to keep the fear from chilling to the bone. Derek's friends came calling in the middle of the night. Mama took their pictures when they thought she couldn't fight. Basement full of crying that stopped without a sound. Mama's in the concrete where she'll never be found. The room fell completely silent. Even the most hardened crime reporters seemed stunned by the raw power of a truth that had been encoded in melody and carried for a decade by a child who refused to let his mother's story die. "Every detail in that song," Sarah said into the silence, "corresponds to evidence we've recovered. The blue tarp Derek used to wrap Carmen's body, the chains and restraints found in his basement, the yellow key hidden behind a pipe, exactly where Eli described, the photographs Carmen took of Derek's associates, even the location of her remains buried beneath the basement floor." The FBI agents were already on their phones, requesting immediate warrants and mobilizing teams. The reporters were transmitting live updates to newsrooms across the country. Social media was exploding as the story spread from the room to the internet, to the world beyond. But the most important audience wasn't in the room at all. Across Chicago, in offices and coffee shops and living rooms, people were watching a homeless teenager sing a song that would destroy one of their city's most respected citizens. The video of Eli's performance began spreading faster than any viral content in the platform's history, shared not for mockery this time, but with the kind of urgent conviction that demanded action. Within 2 hours, Justice for Carmen was trending nationwide. Within 4 hours, Derek Hutchinson's construction company was surrounded by FBI agents executing federal search warrants. Within 6 hours, Derek himself was in custody, his lawyer's objections drowned out by evidence that no amount of influence could suppress. The basement at Derek's house yielded horrors that exceeded even Carmen's documentation. The remains of 3 other women, all undocumented immigrants, whose disappearances had never been investigated. The construction sites Derek had controlled over the years became archaeological digs, uncovering evidence of crimes spanning decades. But perhaps the most powerful moment came that evening, when news cameras captured Derek Hutchinson being led from his house in handcuffs. The man who'd spent 10 years believing he was untouchable, who'd used his wealth and status to silence anyone who threatened him, was finally facing consequences for his actions. As he was placed in the back of a police car, a reporter shouted a question that would become legendary. "Mr. Hutchinson, do you have anything to say to Eli Santos?" Derek looked directly into the camera, his face twisted with the kind of rage that comes from believing you're entitled to hurt others without consequences. "That kid is crazy," he snarled. "Always has been. This is all lies, all fabrication." But his words had no power anymore. The evidence spoke louder than his denials. The victims' voices carried more weight than his protests, and the truth that Eli had preserved in song could no longer be silenced by money or influence or institutional corruption. That night, Eli Santos slept in a real bed for the first time in 5 years. Not in a shelter or a foster home or the backseat of a car, but in a guest room at Father Miguel's residence, surrounded by people who believed in him and protected by a truth that had finally found its voice. The song that had once made teenagers laugh was now being analyzed by forensic experts, played in FBI briefings, and shared by millions of people who understood that sometimes the most important truths come from the most unlikely sources. Derek Hutchinson's empire was crumbling, built as it was on the silence of the powerless. But Eli Santos was no longer powerless, no longer silent, no longer invisible. He was a survivor. He was a witness. He was proof that even the most carefully buried truth will eventually find its way to the surface, carried by voices that refuse to be silenced, no matter how much the world tries to ignore them. The boy who'd been mocked for singing on a bus had become the man who brought down a monster with nothing more than a melody his mother had taught him, and the courage to keep singing when everyone else wanted him to stop. Sometimes justice moved slowly, but when it finally arrived, it came with the power of 10 years of suppressed truth, and no force on earth could stop it from being heard. 2 years later, Eli Santos walked across the stage at Lincoln High School to receive his diploma. The auditorium erupted in applause as his name was called, but the ovation wasn't just for academic achievement. Everyone in that room knew his story, knew what he'd overcome, knew that the young man in the cap and gown represented something far greater than educational success. In the front row sat Sarah Chen, now director of the Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Division. Her promotion coming after the Santos case exposed corruption that reached the highest levels of city government. Beside her sat Father Miguel, who'd become Eli's legal guardian after a judge determined that the teenager needed stability more than another foster placement. Their faces glowed with pride as they watched a boy who'd once been invisible claim his place in the world. The past 2 years had transformed Eli in ways that went beyond physical appearance, though the changes there were remarkable enough. Good nutrition had filled out his frame. Regular sleep had erased the hollow shadows from beneath his eyes, and consistent medical care had addressed health issues that homelessness had made chronic. But the deeper transformation was evident in his posture, his voice, the way he met people's eyes when they spoke to him. He was no longer the boy who hid in corners and whispered his mother's song to cassette players. He'd become someone who understood that his voice mattered, that his story had power, that surviving trauma didn't make him damaged, but rather gave him strength others couldn't imagine. The Derek Hutchinson trial had lasted 8 months and resulted in convictions on 17 federal charges, including murder, human trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy. The evidence Carmen had gathered, combined with Eli's testimony and the physical evidence from the excavation, painted a picture of systematic evil that shocked even experienced federal prosecutors. Derek would spend the rest of his life in prison, but more importantly, his conviction had exposed a network of corruption that led to the indictment of 2 judges, 3 police officials, and a city councilman who'd been paid to look the other way while vulnerable women disappeared. The case became a watershed moment in Chicago's history, a reckoning with systems that had prioritized power over justice for far too long. But the trial's most powerful moment hadn't come from lawyers or expert witnesses. It came when Eli took the stand and sang his mother's song one final time, his voice steady and clear as he looked directly at the man who'd stolen his childhood. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Carmen Santos died trying to save others, the prosecutor had said in her closing argument. Her son lived to make sure she succeeded. The financial settlement from Derek's seized assets had provided Eli with resources he'd never imagined possessing. But money wasn't what had changed his life. It was the discovery that his mother hadn't died in vain, that her courage had protected other women, even though it couldn't save her, that the love she'd poured into teaching him her song had finally found its purpose. Eli used part of the settlement to establish the Carmen Santos Foundation, which provided support services for children who'd been separated from their families by violence or trafficking. The foundation operated out of a renovated building on Chicago's South Side, offering counseling, education, legal assistance, and most importantly, someone who would listen when kids tried to tell difficult truths. Every child has a song, Eli would tell new arrivals at the foundation. Sometimes it takes a while to find people who know how to hear it, but your voice matters, and someone is listening. The Foundation's music therapy program had become particularly renowned, helping traumatized children express experiences that were too painful for ordinary words. Eli often led these sessions himself, sitting with kids who'd been failed by every system designed to protect them and showing them that survival was possible, that healing was achievable, that their stories deserved to be heard. Sarah Chen visited the Foundation regularly, not just as a board member, but as someone who understood that preventing future tragedies required addressing the conditions that made them possible. Her cold case division had solved 12 previously impossible cases using techniques pioneered during the Santos investigation, proving that patient detective work and genuine concern for victims could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. The system didn't protect Carmen Santos, Sarah told new recruits to her division, but we can use what happened to her to protect others. Every cold case represents someone who mattered, someone who deserved justice, someone whose story isn't finished being told. On this graduation day, as Eli walked across the stage to accept his diploma, he carried with him acceptance letters from 6 universities that had offered him full scholarships. Northwestern wanted him for their criminal justice program. University of Chicago had offered a place in their social work school. Columbia was interested in his potential as a human rights advocate, but Eli had already made his decision. He would attend Northwestern, study criminology and victim advocacy, and spend his life ensuring that other children wouldn't have to carry their truths alone for 10 years before finding someone willing to listen. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and celebration, Eli found himself standing alone for a moment outside the auditorium. The evening air was warm with the promise of summer, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear music drifting from a graduation party. He thought about his mother, about the nights she'd worked multiple jobs to keep them fed, about the lullabies she'd sung when the electricity was shut off and candles provided the only light. Carmen Santos had died believing she'd failed to protect her son, never knowing that the song she'd taught him would become the weapon that destroyed her killer. She'd be proud of you, mijo. Eli turned to find Father Miguel approaching, his weathered face soft with affection and pride. The priest had become more than a guardian over the past 2 years. He'd become the father figure Eli had never known, offering guidance without judgment and love without conditions. I hope so, Eli replied, his voice carrying only a trace of the uncertainty that had once defined him. Sometimes I wonder what she'd think of everything that's happened. She'd think her son grew up to be exactly the man she raised him to be, Father Miguel said firmly. Brave, compassionate, unwilling to let injustice stand unchallenged. You didn't just survive what happened to you, Eli. You transformed it into something that helps others. As they walked toward Sarah's car, where she waited to drive them to the celebration dinner she'd planned, Eli reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the bus, where teenagers had mocked his song, to the courtroom, where that same song had convicted a killer. From sleeping in abandoned warehouses to preparing for college. From being invisible to becoming a voice for the voiceless. The viral video that had started everything was still online, viewed now not as entertainment, but as historical document. Comments that had once mocked him now praised his courage. The teenagers who'd filmed him had never apologized, but Eli no longer needed their validation. He'd found something more valuable, the knowledge that his voice mattered, his truth had power, and his mother's love had been strong enough to carry him through the darkest years of his life. Detective Chen, he said as they reached the car. Can I ask you something? Anything, Sarah replied, and meant it. Do you ever think about all the other kids out there, the ones who have stories but nobody's listening, the ones who might be singing their own songs right now waiting for someone to hear them? Sarah smiled, recognizing in his question the same drive that had compelled her to risk her career for his case. Every day. But that's why we do what we do, isn't it? So that maybe the next kid won't have to wait 10 years to be believed. As they drove through Chicago's streets toward a future none of them could have imagined 2 years earlier, Eli Santos understood that his story wasn't ending with graduation. It was just beginning. Tomorrow he would start the next chapter of a life dedicated to ensuring that other children's voices would be heard, that other families would find justice, that other truths would rise from whatever graves powerful people tried to bury them in. The boy who'd been laughed at for singing on a bus had become a man who would spend his life teaching the world to listen. And somewhere in the evening air, carried on the wind that moved through Chicago's neighborhoods, Carmen Santos's song continued to play, transformed from a lament of loss into an anthem of hope. Have you ever lived through something similar? Or do you know someone who has faced such challenges? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps us spread this message of hope and resilience to more people who might need to hear it. The voices of the forgotten matter. The truths of the powerless deserve to be heard, and sometimes justice comes not from those in authority, but from those who refuse to let their songs be silenced, no matter how long the world tries to ignore them. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.